Somewhere in our garage, there is a chunk of cement. It's not very large, and it's painted on one side with what appears to be approximately 3 or 4 colors of spray paint. For all intents and purposes, it just looks like a piece of rubble. And actually, that's what it is. It's rubble from what was once the Berlin Wall. And it was given to us by one of our friends who actually went to Germany. And now, the Berlin Wall, for those of you that perhaps weren't alive then, once stood as a prison wall that separated West Berlin, which was a free city with a bustling economy, from communist East Berlin. And the wall was built in 1961 and ultimately began coming down in 1989. And it was built to keep the people in communist Germany from escaping to the freedom of the West. And I have a couple photos here. So this first one just shows you what it looked like, and there's barbed wire along the top, and it kind of went all along the borders of this city. And then there's another picture here of, when it started to come down, and so that's basically, we have a piece of something that looks like that. Now, in many places, this wall was lined with barbed wire, and often dogs and armed guards and gunboats would patrol the river, because there's a part of it that was, had a river on one side. Well, one day in September of 1988, a tourist on the West German side of the wall captured this daring escape from East Germany on videotape. Now, there were 4 people, and they were each wearing black wetsuits, and they were seen leaping from the top of the Berlin Wall. And one of them, this woman, she broke her ankle in the process. And they scrambled down the riverbank, and they plunged into the river, and they began swimming furiously toward freedom. And onlookers from the West German side could be heard cheering them on. Well, suddenly, this East German patrol boat was seen coming toward them and trying to prevent the escape. And 3 of the swimmers actually made it to shore, and falling into the arms of the very delighted tourists who were watching this whole thing. But the woman who had broken her ankle, she was having a very difficult time making it across the river and swimming. And this patrol boat was, bearing down on her and circling and trying to get her. Well, instinctively, several men from the West German side got in the river and extended their hands, and she's just swimming for everything that she has. And ultimately, she got to safety. She did whatever it took to get to freedom. And we all want freedom. We buy the t-shirts. Freedom. Are we willing to do that? The door has been opened. It's time to walk free. Now, we all want freedom from some things. What do you need freedom from? Guilt, shame, fear, sin, insecurity, addictions, habits, unforgiveness, just destructive thoughts, worry. Well, you and I have been set free from whatever thoughts or habits might be trying to chain us. And we have to walk it out, not throw away or disregard the freedom that Jesus purchased for us. In Romans 6, the Apostle Paul put it this way. He said, I'm using this freedom language because it's easy to picture. You can readily recall, can't you, how at one time, the more you did just what you felt like doing, not caring about others, not caring about God, the worse your life became and the less freedom you had. And how much different is it now as you live in God's freedom, your lives healed and expansive in holiness? I love that picture because true freedom produces a life, a free, expansive life. John 8, Jesus said this, if the Son liberates you, makes you free men, then you are really and unquestionably free. Now, there is no freedom until we actually belong to God. We find the freedom to achieve the greatest desires of our life only when we live in the freedom of that relationship, when we live understanding that we are loved by God, that we have been put on the planet to fulfill a purpose. So how do we do that? How do we live out the free life? Well, in many cases, walking in freedom actually is a process. And part of the process is making different decisions, or we'll end up back in chains. We have been free, so now we have to live differently. And we've been talking about this open door free life. And one of the steps through the open door, one of the steps in living a free life is found in the words of our mouth. What we're saying about ourselves, what we're saying about God. And I spoke about this a few weeks ago when we learned that life and death is found in the power of our words. That our world is framed by the words that come out of our mouth. So if we're going to live the free life, then we have to be very mindful about the world we're framing with our words. And then Philip talked last week about surrender, truly surrendering. And today, I'm going to talk about another step. If we are going to live free, then we have to become true worshipers of God. Now, I am a worship leader. I can't sing two notes in the same key. I sing loud and proud. Anybody with me? When we first started the church, I did everything except lead worship. I worked with the kids. I greeted people. I even plugged some cables in. I worked the overhead projector. Come on, this is the 80s. The overhead projector. How many of you have no idea what an overhead projector is? Find a gray-haired person and ask them. Overhead. So that was my contribution to the team, the worship team, the overhead projector. So I can't sing two notes in the same key. I can't play an instrument. I have, again, never led our church in any kind of singing. But I am a worship leader because I'm a worshiper. And worship is more than songs that are sung. Genuine worship comes from a heart that is consistently connected with God. And that connection happens in two ways. It happens corporately, like here at church and gatherings with fellow believers, and it happens personally, anytime, anywhere. Now, corporate worship is important because our faith increases when we join together with like-minded believers. And personal worship occurs when we take the initiative and adjust our attitudes and just cultivate an atmosphere of praise, which can happen anytime. Worship at its core is expressing love and honor and adoration to our God. And that can be done in a lot of ways. First of all, I'll talk about is just spending time with God. I want to encourage you to spend some moments with God, not just rushing through them. It's not a matter of, okay, I'm a Christian, and the pastor said we have to spend time with God, clocking in and clocking out. No, it's not that. It's about developing a relationship with your loving Creator. And the thing about God is He can't and actually won't ever force a relationship on you. He longs for you to willingly love Him and choose to spend time with Him. If I'm going to have a great relationship with my husband, it will involve spending time with him. And not because it's like, oh, Philip wants to hang out with me again. Oh, I guess I will. Whatever. No, it's time freely and lovingly given. Time talking to him and time listening. And that's the hard part, the listening part, right? So spending time with him. And then the second way that we actually worship God is read the letter that He wrote to you. The Word. Now, I love to read. I love to read. My idea of a great vacation includes a beach and a good book or two or 10. And I read books that teach me. I read books that make me laugh. I read books that inspire me. I read books that make me cry. I read books that trigger my imagination. I just love it when a book can take me outside of myself and bring me into a whole new world. But for all of the books I have read, there is no book that has shaped my life more than the Bible. And the interesting thing about the Bible is while much of it contains stories about other people and other events, it's very personal. And I just think too many people perhaps keep their Bible on a table somewhere and never open it up. They never, even if they've downloaded the Bible app, they don't actually hit read. They don't read it. And God longs for you and me to open it and become familiar with His voice. So my time with God always involves reading His Word. And as I read the Bible, it's almost as if God is inviting me into His very big world and opening up the possibility that His world can become my own. It's by reading the Bible that I learned to walk free. Jesus opened the door, but we have to make choices as we walk through it. And And in my 20s, I used to get my feelings hurt all the time. Philip would say something funny, somebody else would say something funny, and my feelings would get so hurt, I was like, whoa. I would just be so offended. I would carry offense like it's a prize. Right? But the more I read the Bible, the more I opened it up, I learned to get free from offense and be very quick to forgive. I've learned to get free from bad habits. I've learned what it is to be free to actually be who I'm called to be. And then when I was diagnosed with cancer and was getting various treatments, I read his word looking for verses that spoke about him as a healer. I read and I read and I read. His voice assured me of who he is. And then when I've been in challenging family situations, anybody ever had one or two or a dozen of those, right? Because family can be messy, right? And so in challenging family situations, I would look for verses about patience, so I didn't hurt somebody, and love, and peace, and forgiveness. And it's not a question about how much I read, but rather how I let his word shape my day. And some days I would read quite a few chapters, and then some days I would just focus on a couple of verses. His word is our map for living. It is our GPS. It is our navigation system. We'll actually never live the free life if we don't let ourselves be directed by his word. All right. Then the third thing is worship is about determining to get to know who he is, really. Do you know one of the biggest crimes in America is identity theft? And identity theft occurs when someone uses your personally identifying information, like your name or social security number or credit card number, without your permission to commit fraud or other crimes. And in 2017, there was an identity fraud study, and they found that $16 billion was stolen from 15.4 million U.S. consumers in 2016. And we are a victim of this. Philip actually was a victim of this, and our savings account got stolen. So identity theft is frustrating and horrible. And actually, I think in many cases, God has had his identity stolen. I think many people have a wrong idea about who God is. The Bible says that we're supposed to worship God in spirit and in truth. John 4:23 says, "But the time is coming, indeed it's here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." The Father is looking for those who worship him that way. Do you know the Greek word for worship that in this verse is actually the word called proskuno, which literally means to kiss the master's hand in reverence. I love that picture because it indicates both love and absolute utter respect. This is a very powerful combination. So how can we ever worship God without a clear understanding of who he is? The truth about God is essential to worship. If you've been a part of this church for any length of time, you would have heard us reference a story that Jesus tells called the prodigal son. And it's a story of a father who had two sons. And the younger son wants to leave and take his inheritance and go play. Well, the father actually gives it to him. So he took his inheritance and he runs off and he wastes it. And not soon after that, he finds himself living on the streets and in abject poverty. And he comes to himself and he said, "You know what? I need to go home." And he begins the journey home, but all the while he begins the journey home, he's expecting his father to ultimately end up just treating him badly, treating him like a slave. But instead, the father embraces him, shows him love, and welcomes him home. Now, the older brother, who had stayed at the house, had actually never asked the father for anything. And he was so concerned about rules, he couldn't actually even love his younger brother when the brother came back. And the father told him, he said, "Son, everything I had is yours. You could have asked for anything." So the thing is, neither one of them had the right picture of who God was. So many people see God as angry, as this punishing judge. As, people will say, "Oh, I can't go to church, the lightning will strike me." And they're playful, but there is this fear in them that that's what God is doing, looking for reasons to punish. And people might see God as stingy, or as responsible for all the pain in the world. And you know what? None of that is true. And I just think we might have a hard time worshiping God if that's actually what we believe. And so one way to worship God is to know who he is and to declare it. And getting to know God is actually the same with any friend. It takes time, right? In developing a relationship with someone, you get to know what they like, what they don't. We get to know God by discovering who he is. And the Bible is full of descriptions of our awesome God. It tells us that his name is actually equivalent to his presence. And God has quite a few names, all of which describe who he is. Isaiah tells us that his name is Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And then in the book of Ezekiel, I love this. It says, this is a time when we encounter the children of Israel who were in absolute despair, heartbroken, because they had lost or would soon lose everything. Their freedom, their country, their temple, and for many of them, their lives. And in the midst of this devastation, Ezekiel offers them hope, and he's showing them that God is at work. And in fact, he ends this book of Ezekiel by calling the New Jerusalem Yahweh Shammah, which means God is there. I just love that. It's such a great picture of who God is. He is here. We don't serve a God who's abandoned us. His very name means that he's present. So no matter what situation you might be in, you can worship who he is. His name is I am here in the midst of whatever you are. And then Psalm 103 tells me that God is compassionate, that he's slow to anger, that he abounds in love. Tells us that he's generous. Romans 8:32 says, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for all of us, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? So part of worshiping God is actually knowing who he is. So it's spending time with God, it's reading his word, it's knowing who he is, and fourth, it's giving. It's giving. Romans 12:1 says, therefore I urge you, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Some translations say this is a reasonable act of worship. Means it's not extreme, it's reasonable. That what he's saying is to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. So what that's saying is my life is not my own. But a living sacrifice can walk off the altar. We have to choose. Sometimes I will say to myself, I'm Romans 12ing my life today. Reminding myself that I'm his. And it's my reasonable act of worship to surrender everything that I am. You know, we were created in the very image of a giver. God loved us so much that he gave his best. And you know, we are never more like God than when we're giving. I'm worshiping God when I give, which is why, you know, when Philip received the offering today, we say we're continuing our worship of God by receiving the offering. See, in the Bible, when people would bring their sacrifices to the temple to be offered to God, it was worship. Giving is worship. And just relax, I'm not going to take another offering. But listen, giving is worship, so I don't understand why you wouldn't. Giving is worship. It's giving, give a smile, give a hug, give love, give money, give time. Do you know hundreds of volunteers give their time every week as they serve God by welcoming you in the parking lot, by greeting you at the front door, by right now we have the most phenomenal children's ministry in the city. Your children are learning and having a great time encountering God, having the best time. And there are people who are giving of their time. It is worship to God what they're doing with your children. People that put words on the screens, the scriptures that show up on the screen, those don't appear by fairy dust. There are people in this room back here who are amazing. You don't see them. But those people giving of their time, worshiping God by putting verses on the screens. It's worship. Give to your church. It's worship. Give of your talent. Do you know, we have people up here who lead us in singing, and amazing team plays the drums and the bass, and we don't pay these people. They're giving of what they have. They're giving of their talent, and it is worship unto God. You want to be a worshiper? Give. Make that decision. The more I give of myself, the closer to God I feel. Worship will always involve giving. Always. And usually when it's uncomfortable. I'm just saying. If you're feeling particularly grumpy, smile at someone. Give it anyway. Worship is giving. All right, fifth, we worship God by loving people. 1 John 4 says this, we love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he's a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God who he has not seen. And he's given us this command, whoever loves God must also love his brother. Now, there's so many ways to demonstrate love for people. You know, forgiving, helpful, giving to someone. You know, it's very politically correct to use the word tolerance. But can I just say, tolerance is the lowest on the totem pole when it comes to people. We're supposed to be loving people. Loving people, genuinely loving people. Not just, oh, tolerate you. You don't build a marriage by tolerating each other. That's step one. You can start there if you have to. But you better work toward loving. And so loving people is worshiping God. Worshiping God involves being generous with your love. Being generous, helping those who need help. You know, by the way, when you actually give in the offering, it enables us corporately to help those who need it around the city and around the world. Do you know, every time you actually worship God with your offering, it enables us to take care of widows and orphans that you may never meet until you get to heaven. Or people in this city, we get to do what we do together because we actually all are being generous, helping people. Worship involves loving people and helping people. You know, many of us would have heard about two cities in the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah. And they were destroyed because of the wickedness of those cities. And that's true. It was wickedness happening. It was dark. But there's also another reason. Ezekiel 16, it says, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. Do you know, worshiping God will always include taking our eyes off of ourselves and helping someone else. Always. And sometimes the most important step in walking the free life is found helping someone else. Are you just feeling so stressed and bound by something? Take your eyes off your sad little self and say, who can I help right now? Worshiping God will always include helping other people. So yes, worship is time with God. It's reading his word. It's getting to know who he is. It's giving. It's loving people. And it is singing songs. Or speaking out loud, declaring who he is. You know, many times in the midst of challenging situations, what I need is the presence of God. And the Bible tells me that God actually inhabits the praises of his people. Psalm 22, but you are holy, you who inhabit the praises of Israel. So I begin to worship him, declare praises. There's so many times I will just shout out, I love you, I exalt you. You are the King of kings and the Lord of lords. There is no name higher than your name. Declaring who he is. Do you know, worship is actually an act of warfare against the powers of darkness. So whether you are, it's an addiction you're trying to overcome, or a habit that you're trying to break, or you're just pushing past the fear. When enemies surround you, it is worship that defeats them. Jehoshaphat, who in the Bible, he was the king of Judah at one point. And at one point in his reign, he was surrounded by some enemies, a lot of enemies. They were surrounding him. He was outnumbered. And, he just surrounded by a lot of ites. The Moabites, the Ammonites, Meunites, Canaanites, all the ites were surrounding him. And they all actually wanted to destroy him. That was their mission in life, destroy him. I imagine it was pretty terrifying. Maybe his life flashed in front of him. But he did an amazing thing. He actually didn't get angry with God. He didn't shake his fist and go, why is this happening? But before they marched into battle, he bowed down and he worshiped God. And then he appointed a choir who were going to march ahead of the troops. A choir. The praise team. He didn't put the guys with the swords in front. He put the worship leaders. Now, how many of you want to join the worship team? So they're singing, give thanks to God. His love never quits. Here they are surrounded by enemies. It is not looking good. And they're singing, thank you, God. You are faithful. Your love never quits. And God said this to him in 2 Chronicles 20. This is God speaking to him. He says, Jehoshaphat, you will not have to fight this battle. Take up your positions, which is worship. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will give you Judah and Jerusalem. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Go out to face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. So Jehoshaphat bowed down with his face to the ground, and all the people of Judah and Jerusalem fell down and worshiped before the Lord. And while they worshiped, then God set ambushes, and the enemies were destroyed. What battle are you facing? Worship. What is coming against you? Worship. You won't defeat the enemy by yourself. So when the enemies are around you, worship. There have been so many times when I've taken my phone with its worship playlist out to my backyard, and I've turned the music up loud, and I've just sung, and I've shouted, and in the midst of tough and challenging seasons, I have shouted thanks to God for his presence, for his love, for his faithfulness. I didn't know how everything was going to turn out. I just knew that I needed his presence. And if I was going to get free from fear or doubt or even sadness, see, sometimes we all can just get sad. If we're not careful, that sadness will just continue to spiral down and down and down. And the only thing that breaks that is worship. Is worship. Now, our church services start with worship. We have people who can sing in key, lead us, and a band who can play amazingly, lead us in corporate worship. It is a time when we get to express gratitude to the God who loves us. And I love this time. I love this time. Still, over the years, there have been moments when, you know what? I didn't want to go to church, which is not like a really good thing because I'm a pastor. Right? But it was a rough season, and I didn't want the eyes of people on me. I just wanted to be alone. And yet, as a follower of Jesus, I got myself here, and I don't get to hide in the back. I get myself right here to the front row, and I worship with everything in me. I worship, and sometimes I worship, and there's tears streaming down my face. But what I know is the more I worship, the more confident I was that I became that God would see me through whatever situation I'm in. I can worry or I can worship, but I can't do both. We get to choose. So worship. Worship not only brings freedom in our own lives, but it actually has the power to set other people free. Acts chapter 16 tells us the story of when Roman soldiers beat the Apostle Paul and his fellow missionary Silas, beat them to within an inch of their life. They flogged these men, and they were bleeding and in pain, and Paul and Silas were now imprisoned because of their faith. And somehow, bleeding and in pain and unjustly imprisoned, they began to praise God. They began to sing to him. And I don't actually think this was a conscious plan. I don't think Paul looked at Silas and said, here's the deal, Silas. Let's sing and let's praise God, and then he'll probably send an earthquake and deliver us. No, I imagine in a very cracked and hurting voice, Paul said, Silas, how you doing? Maybe all Silas could do is just moan. And then Paul said, you know what? The only thing that can improve this place is the presence of God. We need the presence of God. So they reminded themselves who God is. And they praised him and they expressed their gratitude to the King of Kings. And then God entered the scene and in this particular case, opened the jail doors and they were freed. God always enters the scene when we praise him. Do you know worship? Worship makes the veil between this world and the world to come very thin, very thin. And it says that as they were worshiping, as they were in pain and worshiping, it says that other prisoners were listening to their worship. And I'm sure those other prisoners were in pain and they wanted what Paul and Silas had. We know the jailer did. And you know, I think it's the same in our lives. There are hurting people all around us, at work, school, just walking down the street, in Starbucks, that person trying to help you in the store. There's hurting people all around us. They need what we have. Do we actually invite God's presence to abide with us? Do we praise him even in the midst of our own prison cells? Do you know what I found is that you probably won't get all your questions answered. But for me, I learned to just rest in the knowledge that God hasn't left me. And maybe you've just gotten divorced and you're wondering if you'll ever love again. Can you trust God that this is not the end of your journey? That he will lead you? Or maybe you just filed for bankruptcy and you have no idea what the future holds. Will you just begin to declare, even softly, you're never going to leave me. You're never going to desert me. I worship you, Lord of Lords and King of Kings. See, basically what it comes down to is worship is putting him first. Always. Even under pressure. When you're under pressure, when you feel stressed, when things aren't going the way you want them to go, what do you turn to? A drink? A cigarette? A joint? Pornography? Eating? Shopping? What do you turn to? Well, what he's saying is worship. Put him first. Go to God first. You know, we often say, you're my Lord, but then we go through a challenge and we take the steering wheel ourselves. Right? In order to discover God's will for our life, in order to live the free life, we actually have to surrender control. And it starts when we say, my life is not my own. Romans 12, not my own. I have been bought with a high price. I am your servant by choice. So King Jesus, what do you want from me today? Forgive, give, serve. I remember when my son Jordan was born. He just turned 30. Actually, I can't believe I have a 30-year-old. How did that happen? I don't even know. But I remember when he was born, and for the first few days of his life, whenever we would have to drive, I mean, he's just this teeny baby in the car seat. Actually, he wasn't so teeny. He was basically almost 10 pounds when he was born. I had a toddler. And I would drive so carefully because it was scary to think of being on the roads in crazy LA with this precious baby in the car. In fact, I would have the baby on board sticker, as if that helps. It made me feel better. It does. I'm sure it does nothing. It's not like anybody went, oh, baby on board, let me go all the way around. No. But you know what? That wasn't as scary as the moment when he turned 16 and I gave him the car keys. When he moved from the passenger seat to the driver's seat. Because I was no longer in control. I could stomp on my imaginary brake and nothing happened. Because I was not in control. It's a big moment in your life when you hand someone else the keys, when you trade seats. Because whoever's in the driver's seat has control. See, it's like if you drive, I have to trust you. Because up to now, I've been driving. I choose the speed, I choose the destination. These are my keys, and we're going my way. And sometimes I think that's what we say to Jesus. These are my keys. We're going my way. I mean, Jesus, you can be in the car, but I'm in control. I mean, a lot of us find it handy to have Jesus in the car, in the passenger seat, because, I mean, something might come up and you might need him. Like, Jesus, I'm feeling a little sad. I need some help. Jesus, I'm a little stressed. I need some of your peace. I want you in the car, just not so sure I want you driving. Because if he's driving, then he's in control and I'm not. If he's driving, then I'm not in control of my wallet. It's actually his. If he's driving, I'm not in control of my ego. My life is his. If he's driving, I'm not in charge of my mouth. I don't get to gossip when I want to, or lie, or yell at someone. It's not my mouth. Luke 9:23, Jesus talking, he said, then he told them what they could expect for themselves. Anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. So I get out of the driver's seat and I hand the keys to him. So here's the question. Who's driving your life? Worship is putting him first. I mean, is Jesus in the car just doing a ride along? Or does he actually have the driver's seat? There's not a way that comes to God that doesn't involve surrendering the keys to him. Following God is not about behavior modification. It's a heart transformation. It's saying, I'm not driving my life anymore. It is me decreasing so that he can increase. You know, one of the most powerful tools in any recovery program is not to say I'm trying not to drink. It's surrendering our will to his. The only way to be free is to hand over the keys. Put him first. Worship is putting God first. It's spending time with him. Sunday is the first day of the week. Here you are. You've already spent time with God on the first day. You've worshiped him by putting him first today. Reading his word, getting to know who he is. It's giving. God calls when bringing the tithe, he says giving the first part of your income, not what's left at the end of the month. First, worship is putting him first. And worship defeats the enemy. And you know, if you're like most of us, there's some stuff going on in your life. Some challenges around you, perhaps. Worship is what defeats the enemy. You can shake your fist, you can get angry, but worship is actually what defeats the enemy. Worship is putting God first. Now, at the end of our gathering today, we have some people who are going to get baptized. People who have made a decision to put God first. They've raised their hand perhaps in a church service, and now they're making the decision to publicly declare that I'm a follower of Jesus, which is awesome. And while that's happening, we're going to be singing worship songs, singing songs. So that can either be filler music for you or can be worship. So maybe there's some enemies in your life right now. Maybe it's just whether it's finances or relationship or just some challenges happening. You can worry or worship. I'm just suggesting that you worship and let God do what only he can do. He can set the ambushes where they need to be set. So as people are getting baptized, we're worshiping, and let's just trust that God will do what he can do as we worship. You can get to the parking lot later. You can pick up your phone later, turn it on, but just let's worship him.